Chapter 4 is a mixed bag of great ideas, but with awkward and sometimes downright bad implementation. In this way, it follows the other chapters by continuing the approach of throwing ideas at the wall to see what sticks, something Chapter 2 and 3 also did. There's a lot I enjoyed and parts that made me want to yeet my keyboard across the room. So let's get into it.
Kissing! Goodness!
We're introduced to many new characters in this chapter as the world and story continues to expand. The benefit is that I was rarely bored, in contrast to how I felt playing Deep Sleep. In Chapter 3 there were entire sections where I was emotionally unengaged, wandering around Playcare, waiting for Catnap or some other enemy to show up. It felt like the devs spent so much time building an environment that less time was spent making things actually happen. But Chapter 4 changes this. Whether it's the Doctor testing us, the plot with Doey and Poppy, or the threat of Yarnaby, something interesting is always happening. Instead of sections that feel like puzzle time wasters, we become more actively engaged with the world, helping the time fly by. Chapter 3 had the player alone, with only the voice of Ollie for most of its runtime. Once Poppy leaves us in the opening of Chapter 4, this could have easily turned into a similar experience. But thankfully, they utilised a lot more characters and interactions, which not only made things more exciting, but created a stronger pace that kept me engaged, up until a point. So now the biggest downside of having so many new faces. Most are undeveloped and underutilised. The biggest crime here was done to Harley Sawyer, the Doctor.
Now what's this?
Now I'm a ride or die for Huggy, and aside from a couple, most monsters have not impressed me in these games. But as soon as I saw the Doctor's design and heard his voice, I was incredibly hyped. His voice acting, done by Baldwin Williams Jr., is, in my opinion, the best in the game. He makes such a cool, interesting villain who has a ton of importance to the plot. However, he's in a game which now has this huge cast and a heap of lore to feed players. And so tragically, inevitably, the Doctor ends up one of the easiest enemies in the entire franchise. We have so little time with each of these characters that the very thing I just praised becomes a double-edged sword. We only need to look at Pianosaurus, which, well, the less I say about that, the better. Most of the time gets dedicated to Doey, this chapter's big bad. Unlike previous monsters, Doey starts off friendly and over time reveals his instability and rage. In theory, this is a great concept. Doey's story is tragic and different from previous installments. But my issues with Doey begin right about here. See, when you put our next monster on the title screen like that, it kind of tells the players what to expect. We know Doey is going to turn on us, and just in case you had any doubts, the game all but shouts it every chance it can. Every tape is like, yeah, Doey's got anger issues. He's 900 pounds of PTSD Play-Doh and he might have killed some people. Thanks, game. I really needed that spoon-fed to me just to make sure I had zero doubts that he was going to turn on me. It's like the game isn't confident in its voice actors and decisions to allow the natural progression of the story. It starts to feel like the notes and tapes are crutches rather than enhancements to the story. I just got so sick of reading notes. It felt like I was interrupting the actual game in order to read a mini novel. And you don't want to skip them either, just in case they have useful information. It became this tedious job of checking notes and waiting for tapes to finish. But if we're going to talk about gameplay, then oh boy, do I not have good news on that front either. Going through an entire Yarnaby section, minus said monster, because he just decided not to spawn. Well, it definitely sped my game up, so I had more time to read notes. There was a new mechanic of squeezing through small spaces, which I was excited for because I was expecting something like this to happen.
Little pig.
But nope, it's rarely used to strong effect, and it just becomes another way of adding obstacles in certain areas. Speaking of bugs, I had the fun of Boss Doey throwing me into a fence where I became stuck so he could kill me. Then again, he also killed me just for the heck of it at times. Somehow, they made a worse boss fight than Catnap, which I didn't really think was possible. I mean, Catnap's fight took longer, but at least it was somewhat rewarding. Whereas here, I just had to hope that Doey wasn't going to use his god powers on me like a troll. I also hate that they keep making boss monsters look overly complicated and awkward, when their original design is usually much better. The boss fights are too complicated as well. Both the mechanics and the looks are trying way too hard, when simplicity is usually better. I also think Doey would have worked better with a child actor. For a game that focuses so heavily on children, it's strange that most voices are adults, and the only child actor in the games is a monster pretending to be a child.
Stay where you are.
And listen closely.
In many ways, Chapter 4 is an improvement. Poppy Playtime is just one of those games where they fix one thing only to create a whole new problem. I respect that they're trying things, but I'd rather they stick with what works, even if it's more basic. I'll give the game a 6.5 out of 10, because nothing really happens that stood out to me, but... Well, hang on a second. Who's that?
Security is very important to us here. If I were you, I'd start running.
Okay, so that reveal does push the game up a mark, because I am very biased and I love Huggy. Huggy's return is something that was so obviously planned and confirms the rule number 1 of any good horror film or game: if you don't see a body, they can always come back. And Huggy's chapter is still the most iconic and memorable because his chase scene was basically perfect, no notes needed. It's the kind of lightning in the bottle that I'm worried they won't be able to repeat with him in Chapter 5, but I'm here to see them try. Huggy's return also confirms that Chapter 5 should be the last, and I just hope they give our remaining characters the proper on-screen time. With Kissy, Huggy, Poppy and the prototype, we don't need any more big character reveals or lore dumps. I don't want them to just throw stuff at the wall to see what sticks. I just want a focused game that knows what it's doing. It doesn't need to be padded out with random puzzles and confusing mechanics. It just needs to be simple and good, to stick with what it does best, which I think is story, character animations, and mood. I really hope they have a more solid idea as to what Chapter 5 should be. With any luck, we might get a game that feels consistent in story, gameplay, and pacing. And maybe, if we're really lucky, some real scary scenes with what is, in my opinion, still the scariest character of the series. Here's to hoping that Chapter 5 learns the lessons of the past and finishes this story on a high note. I've got another idea in the works for a Huggy Wuggy video, as well as a theory that I was going to include here, but I think I'll save it for that video instead. So if that interests you, or you'd like to see more horror content in general, please subscribe. It really helps me out. You can also leave a like if you're feeling saucy. See you all in the next one.